about, talking about, and actually acting upon. And that is this tendency of politicians to act as if we can do whatever we want. Well, that is, we can do whatever we want until someone stops us. I know you don't want to believe that that's how legislators think. And frankly, I don't want to believe it either, but I'm going to show you some pretty convincing evidence that is the case. We'll talk about a couple of things that are currently being debated and tossed back and forth within the Idaho legislature, and ways that the media is doing its best to nudge the conversation in what it considers the proper direction.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm going to start off with a doozy of a quote from Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder. Now, Chuck has been on a lot of people's radar because I don't know if there has been any legislator who's been working harder to protect the status quo than Senator Winder. But I want you to see this quote. Unfortunately, I could not play the video for you, but I'm going to show. This is a direct quote from him talking about a conversation he had with an Idaho State Supreme Court justice. And he asked the justice this question. He said, how do we know when a law is constitutional or not as a legislative body? And Senator Winder says, well, you know what he told me? He told me it's constitutional when you approve it until someone proves that it isn't. I'm just going to let that sink in for just a second. It's constitutional when we approve it until somebody proves that it isn't. Do we believe in limited government or not? Because that really is one of those yes or no questions. Are you pregnant or not? It's a yes or a no. There aren't shades of, well, it depends, you know. And in this case, you know, what Senator Winder is saying is actually really a kind of a neat little peek into the mind of how a lot of politicians think. Well, as long as we have the power, we can do pretty much whatever we want till someone calls us on it or gets a judge to agree that, yeah, that's probably something you shouldn't be doing. How often do we see this? This is the nature of bureaucracy. By the way, I like how Mac Raslin puts it. He says, this is the problem we face. How many of them, meaning legislators, know anything about that fine document, meaning the Constitution? He says there needs to be consequences for going against the Constitution, just like we have for breaking their laws. There needs to be heavy punishments for breaking the supreme law of the land. Now, I also like how Stop Idaho Rhinos put it, and that is, don't worry, government. Everything you do is constitutional till the courts tell you that it isn't. Now, again, I know we elect people to go and to represent us. That's what we have, is a representative form of government. And we send them there with the best of intentions. You're going to represent us, represent our interests, and they probably mean well. Now, I've never seen a better, more diplomatic description, though, of the transformation that takes place than the one that Brian Allman offered in a recent piece that he had published on the Gem State Chronicle. So let me share with you a couple excerpts from what Brian points out. This rings extremely true to me. In theory, he says legislating is simple. A lawmaker can draft a bill, present it to a committee, then ask his or her fellow legislators to support it. If a majority of each chamber agrees, then it goes to the governor's desk. His signature turns that bill, which started as an idea, into the law of the land. And that's pretty much the version most of us learned, in our high school civics class. Now, Brian says, in reality, there's more to it. It's not quite so cut and dried as it may seem in a high school civics class. Legislators are human beings and are subject to the same office politics as any other job. We like to think that the legislature is only concerned with ideas, but unfortunately, he says that's not the case. There are personalities at play, egos, and above all, a desire for power. So while some good legislators go to the Capitol with the intention of creating good policy, too many people go there only looking to increase their own power. And I love how he describes, how can you tell these people? They trade votes like poker chips, hoping to gain support for their own bills or simply expand their own influence. Over and over again, we see moderate Republicans make common cause with Democrats to defeat conservative legislation and maintain the power of the political establishment. The budget coup, which we talked about in the last episode, was only the latest example of this unholy alliance and one of the few times in which the establishment was defeated. He's right. They aren't used to losing because not only do they have, the powers that be, the power of the incumbency and people in high places, I guess would be one way to put it, but they also have a very compliant press, which will run interference for them. And anybody who stands up or questions, hey, should we really be spending this kind of money, will be questioned as some kind of extremist or some kind of radical who otherwise is just against basic human decency that we're led to believe can only be accomplished by government. I know it's kind of a vicious circle, but you and I are the ones responsible for pulling ourselves out of it. Isn't it a little bit better, though, to understand that those are some of the temptations that your legislators face? And this is why you can't just wind them up and let them go to legislate each session. You have to stay in touch with them. You have to be aware of what they're working on and make sure that they're hearing from you. Their job is to represent you. And if you're not willing to step up there and say, okay, I'm here to be represented, trust me, there are plenty of special interests with some nice checks in hand waiting for access to that legislature so that they too can be represented. Wink, wink, if you get my drift. All right, let's give you an example of some of the legislative. There's been a lot of talk about harmful materials, which harmful materials in scare quotes as if they don't really exist, but a revamped bill to remove harmful materials from libraries now heads to the Idaho Senate. This was published a couple of days ago on idahocapitalsun.com. The legislation would require public and school libraries to create book review, removal process, and allow patrons to sue the library. Now, I want you to watch how this very carefully steers away from any conversation about protecting children. So the article tells us Senator Melissa Wintrow of Boise says protecting children means protecting all kids. She recalled how she wasn't taught what sexuality meant growing up in an evangelical household. When she got to college, she said she didn't even know how her body worked. That is scary because I had other people, boys, telling me how it works and I should trust them. That was my first lesson as a young adult. So it's important to provide information, Wintrow said. The bill now heads to the full Idaho Senate for possible debate. Okay, now granted, Senator Wintrow may have grown up in a household where sex was not something that her parents were comfortable talking about. I remember getting scolded, by my dad the first time I asked about the facts of life. Don't embarrass your mother by asking those kind of questions. But it's not the state's responsibility to teach us how our bodies work. And frankly, as I'm going to show you, there are plenty of activists waiting in the wings to access those state-sponsored venues. That's a fancy way of saying classrooms, so that they can have a captive audience to share the good news with. So when Melissa Wintrow says, well, we need these books in the library because everybody needs to know how their body works, that's not the place of a taxpayer-funded institution. It's not. And if family isn't teaching it, well, you should have aunts and uncles that are looking at it. It should be family first. The state is not the moral oracle when it comes to bestowing wisdom. And particularly, again, with some of the people who have seized the levers of power, and I'm talking primarily the woke, they're not all about, these are the basics you need to understand. This is how human reproduction takes place. This is, what drives human sexuality. No, it's pretty much, let's see how much we can get away with. How far can we push this? All right, moving on. If a patron finds a child has access to an item that was previously deemed harmful to minors, the article tells us, under a decision from either the committee or the board, they could sue a library for $250 in statutory damages, as well as actual damages and other relief. Now, the bill would require Idaho libraries to establish what it calls a materials review committee, with at least 3 people who live in the school or library district and contain at least one parent of a minor. Libraries must also, under the bill, provide a relocation form for patrons who believe materials are harmful to minors. Patrons who file such a form would be entitled to a public hearing by the committee. Libraries would also be required to provide at least 1 week public notice for hearing in the paper. I mean, it sounds fairly reasonable. They're trying to address all sides here. But again, look at this slight nudge too. But now, keep in mind, keeping these harmful materials, it's not about protecting children. Heather Stout, a retired librarian from North Idaho, says the bill isn't needed. It's fair for parents to take issue with subjects in the library, but they can't parent other people's kids. And allowing fines for librarians will only intensify what she calls the exodus of Idaho librarians. Ah, yes, going to those free-thinking states. Wait, are we just supposed to believe that everybody who doesn't believe in conservative politics is somehow fleeing the state? I don't think that's the case. Anyway, this bill seems to be responding to an entirely politically manufactured crisis that was both created by and will now be solved by legislators with little or no concern for the reality of what's happened in these important public institutions. I'm sorry. Shouldn't have watched Blazing Saddles, but it just seemed like that was the right place for a harumph, said West Ada School District Education Association President Zachary Borman. Where is the concern about the children here? Where's the concern about keeping them from, harmful materials? And I think Idaho Freedom Foundation President Ron Nate had some very good points when he testified before a committee recently and said, look, number one, this is codifying certain things in law that we're actually trying to keep out of libraries, and it's basically codifying saying, but as long as you remove them or separate them from the other things, why do they need to be there in the first place? What purpose does it serve? And no, I'm not talking about, to catch a mockingbird or to kill a mockingbird or something like that. I'm just talking about Catcher in the Rye or anything like that. I'm talking about the books that have very graphic depictions of various deviant sexual acts, encouraging kids to explore themselves or explore their neighbor or whatever and learn about it. It's inappropriate material to be giving to kids that young. So where's the talk about protection for the kids? And something Ron pointed out that I thought was spot on is, why would we talk about segregating this in K through 12 schools where by definition, the kids there are minors? Why would you have an adult section in an institution that is primarily about educating minors? The vast majority of people coming into that library, utilizing that library, are going to be minors. Doesn't it make you wonder, why are some people so intent? We have to get this material before these kids. I know Senator Wintrow would say, well, it's because, I wasn't taught these things at home. Well, but you learned them once you got out in the world. And isn't that kind of how it is? Innocence doesn't last very long, but it just seems like there's this cadre of people who think it's their prerogative to strip as much innocence away from our kids as possible. And what's worse is when you take that into account with the fact that kids already feel awkward, especially as they're starting to go through puberty or just entering into puberty, capturing those feelings and trying to twist them in a direction that kid otherwise might not choose by introducing those kinds of ideas to them. Yeah, I don't think that passes the sniff test. When did libraries become the battleground for this? This librarian who says, well, it's a politically motivated battle. It is, but it's not from the people who are responding to it saying, we got to protect our kids. It's a politically motivated battle by whoever thought it was a great idea to bring harmful materials into the library in the first place and then fight to keep them. That's who started this. All right, I'll move on here. Hey, here's some good news too, and this is one that you need to be aware of. Senator Brian Lenny says right now in Idaho, public health districts have the keys to the kingdom. They've got carte blanche to do literally all things under the banner of public health. And he reminds us, and they did. They closed down businesses. They masked our kids, arrested moms in parks. They put snipers on the roof to quell public protests. Now, this unchecked power, he says, is a ticking time bomb for personal freedoms, especially considering that we could have another pandemic, by the way, proper use of air quotes there, any day now. So let's put a leash on this wild beast, shall we? And this was an invitation on Twitter to watch his closing remarks in favor of his bill that would do exactly that, which would take those kinds of decisions out of the hands of public health. They could be advisory. Absolutely, we want your best advice, but you have no power to make policy. That makes a ton of sense. Let's back it up here with an attaboy from Ryan Spoon, who says this was 100% the problem with the COVID pandemic in Idaho. He says the elected politicians would never have dared to directly oppress citizens like that. So instead, they passed the decisions to unelected bureaucrats with unlimited powers. Those health districts should be advisory only. Let's take it one step further, though. Let's talk about not just what happened in Idaho, but generally. AJK, who I think has one of the clearest views on this matter of anybody I've read, says the uproar over the CDC reducing their isolation guidance for COVID makes one thing crystal clear. COVID hysteria is a devastating chronic disease. Not the disease itself, the hysteria. COVID presents itself as a day or so of mild, transitory, cold-like symptoms for the vast majority of people. Now, she says COVID hysteria, on the other hand, has emerged as a chronic mental health disorder that is impervious to rational thought. Risk factors include underlying anxiety issues or general fearfulness, lack of purpose or meaning in their lives, impaired capacity for risk assessment, lack of coping skills, limited capacity for emotional self-regulation, underdeveloped sense of personal agency, unsubstantiated entitlement, significant social deficits. Now, listen to her recommendation here. AJ says, here's a very super easy recommendation to CDC to reduce further transmission of COVID hysteria. Very simply, never ever use panic, hyperbole, and lies as public health compliance strategy again. And by the way, that goes for public health leaders in Idaho and in every state for that matter. Every one of them fudged things just to try to stay in power. And let's not forget our mainstream media, our corporate legacy media, which did its very best to enforce the narrative and to make sure that anybody who questioned it was being disparaged and smeared, and doubt and shame was being cast on them. That's part of being a narrative enforcer. So where does all of this come from? I want to share with you a quote from Friar John Noggle, who says, we should be open to considering that the insanity of the past 3 years was possible precisely because far too many of us believed that it was impossible. Even after 2 world wars and multiple economic and social crises, the overly optimistic myth that we're so much smarter and more rational than our ancestors has continued on, even as the intellectual and moral virtues have been in steady decline. I know that makes people uncomfortable. Moral virtues? Well, you're going to go around imposing goodness on everybody. Not hardly. Because for virtues and for morals to be authentic, they have to be freely chosen. You can't force them. I know that's got to be a surprise to the woke crowd, but there it is. But we saw the dictators come out in force during COVID. In fact, I wanted you to see this quote. This is from Fulton Sheen in God and War. Back in 1942, Fulton Sheen wrote, dictators are like boils, superficial manifestations of an inner rottenness. They would never have come to the surface if there had not been proper conditions in the world from which they came. I know that that's almost worth going back and rereading. Let me share with you a couple of headlines that illustrate why this is a fight that is continuing. And I know that there are those who may too, well, this is just, the legislature making up things and just driving wedges between people, but it's not. And again, the press is its own worst enemy when it comes to this kind of stuff. Look, here's the Salt Lake Tribune bemoaning, oh, Utah teachers wouldn't be able to have pride flags or other political symbols in class under updated bill. So obviously they're not happy about that, but I have to ask, why would you want their pride flag or other political, symbols? Now look, did we have political symbols? Absolutely. We stood and pledged allegiance to one of them over in the corner every single morning. I mean, that was just how it was done. But then again, that flag wasn't being used to try to separate us from our parents' values and shepherd us into a new type of activism. And that's the thing. I don't see the Salt Lake Tribune or the Idaho Statesman or other mainstream papers, at least what remains of them. I don't see them ever asking the question, why is it so important that those things be in a classroom in the first place? Again, it's a question of appropriateness, but I'm sure they would spin it to, no, you just don't like gay people. So the First Amendment, says ACLU of Idaho, does not grant school officials a free right to refuse to address transgender students by the pronouns consistent with their gender identity. Such thundering prose to say they have a right to dragoon you into their fantasy. Look, it's freedom of association. And just because someone is a teacher in a public school doesn't mean that they give up their freedom of association. But again, who is forcing this issue? Did teachers suddenly get together, or did school officials or even students for that matter get together and say, hey, let's pick on the transgender? No. Transgender activism was introduced into the school system where it is currently causing chaos, and the ACLU of Idaho to make, incomprehensible statements like the one they just made. So there. Look, it's another gem from Melissa Wintrow. This is in response to an Idaho Statesman article. The headline here is this really the future that Idaho wants? Liberty and freedom, but only for him or her? Wow, how non-inclusive. Melissa Wintrow quotes from it. Whether we have transgender or non-binary or gender fluid persons in our life, they do exist. They have children and love them. They attend church. They are our neighbors. They are deserving of the same rights and freedoms as every other citizen. Okay, now I have never heard anybody argue otherwise. But what you don't have a right to do is to force your way into some kind of preferential either treatment or recognition on behalf of everybody else, especially if it's encouraging people to defy reality in order to accommodate you. Actually, I kind of like how this was put by James Auberton. Agreed. Everyone has the same rights. And those in crisis should be able to get help. Don't ask us to indulge delusions or ignore facts. Now, there's no way to say it soft enough for that not to sound terribly mean to some people. But think about it from the standpoint of, whatever you consider yourself. Do you have the right to go around and force people? You will do this. You will address me as that. Especially if you're asking them to do something that seems in contravention to what's self-evident fact. That Adam's apple, the sound of your voice and that kind of thing. It's not to make other people's lives more miserable, but I think sometimes we have to be willing to draw those reasonable limits around ourselves as well as around our kids. It's a lot to think about, but just keep in mind, we can do what we want is the attitude of far too many people in government. It's up to you and me to hold them accountable. Now, we have opportunities to do that. We'll be talking about some of those ways coming up in the next episode. Thanks again for joining us. This is Nowhere to Hide.
Are biased, the Idaho Press Club are biased, all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see.
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.